To introduce myself, my name is Christy Bowie, and today I will be showing you how to find the reciprocal trigonometric ratio. To start off, we need to introduce the basic trigonometric functions. Leading into the three main functions, we have sine, cosine, and tangent. Since we know the main three, we also need to know the reciprocal form of these functions, that being cosecant, secant, and cotangent. Together, all these form the six basic trigonometric functions. To elaborate more on what these functions mean, we must remember the phrase SOHCAHTOA. With this phrase, you will be able to memorize the meaning of the functions easier. First, we have SO, representing sine. We can see that the O and the H represents opposite over hypotenuse. This goes for the other two. CA. CA represents cosine. With the A and the H, it represents adjacent over hypotenuse. Same goes with TOA. TOA represents tangent, which means that the O and the A represents opposite over adjacent. With this, we are able to figure out the reciprocal version of the functions. Knowing that the reciprocal is the flipped version of the original, we can conclude that sine is opposite over hypotenuse. Then cosecant is the hypotenuse over opposite. Same with the other two. Secant is hypotenuse over adjacent, while cotangent is adjacent over opposite. Moving on to the next slide, the question here asks to determine the six trigonometric ratios of angle R. We know that the longest side of the triangle is always the hypotenuse, which lays the opposite from the 90-degree angle. Since we are looking at the triangle from the angle R, the opposite will be what lies across from the R, while the adjacent is what lies right next to it. Since we already figured out what the hypotenuse is, that only leaves one spot to figure out where the adjacent lies. Looking back at the previous slide, we are given the phrase SOHCAHTOA. We know that each one of these represents sine, cosine, or tangent. Therefore, when we're looking at sine, we are looking for opposite over hypotenuse. When we look at this triangle, we know that the opposite is 5 while hypotenuse is 13. That only leads us to the answer of 5 over 13. Same goes for cosine. Cosine here we're looking for adjacent over hypotenuse. We know adjacent is 12 while hypotenuse is 13. That leaves us to 12 over 13. The tangent, we're looking for the opposite over adjacent. Opposite is 5 while adjacent is 12. That leaves us to 5 over 12. Same goes for the reciprocal. The reciprocal is basically the same concept of this, except it's just the opposite, or the flipped version. So here we have cosecant, which is hypotenuse over opposite. Notice how the sine is opposite over hypotenuse. Therefore, the reciprocal version of that is hypotenuse over opposite. Therefore, we're looking for 13 over 5. Yes, while here we're looking for secant, which is hypotenuse over adjacent. Hypotenuse 13, adjacent 12. So that's 13 over 12. Cotangent, we're looking for adjacent over opposite. So that gives us 12 over 5. And that concludes the lesson about finding the reciprocal trigonometric ratio. Thank you.